Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the Midtown Scholar Bookstore. My name is Alex. Thank you for joining us this evening for the celebratory book launch for Allie Rothrock. Let's just pause. This is a party. Let's give it up for Allie. We're happy you're here. We hope you feel safe, and we hope you enjoy tonight's program. Before we begin, of course, as always, a few housekeeping notes. One, while our speakers will take their masks off this evening for the conversation, we please ask that you continue to keep your masks on throughout the program, including the audience Q&A, and thank you for your understanding with that. Two, this event is being live streamed on Zoom, so for those tuning in, please feel free to ask questions at any point via the Q&A box, and we'll try to get to as many questions as we can after the conversation. Three, we are now starting to announce many more events in May, June, and beyond. So please stay tuned to our website, social media pages, and e-newsletter to stay tuned to the latest events. And lastly, perhaps most importantly, this night is for Allie. Please consider buying the book and supporting the bookstore and our author this evening by purchasing a copy up at the cafe counter. Every purchase helps support the author, the bookstore, and our ability to run these events as free and open to the public. We will have a book signing afterwards. If you have the book right now, it is signed, but Allie is happy to personalize the books for you after the event. But at this time, it's my honor to introduce our speakers this evening. Our interviewer this evening is Carl Antecel. Carl is a father, a husband, and the spark to other people's flames. Through years of experience in advocacy and business development, Carl helps empower passionate individuals to have more impact by creating the space for that passion to turn into purpose. Of course, our featured author this evening is Allie Rothrock. Allie is a leading voice in trauma recovery and mental health nationwide. She is the founder and CEO of On the Job and Off, and the executive director for First Responders Care, two organizations dedicated to building more resilient first responders who take an active role in their communities. Her first book, Where Hope Lives, tells the story of her challenging entry into the fire service. Rothrock is a certified trauma responder through the Association of Traumatic Stress Specialists and a behavioral health specialist with the Medical Reserve Corps. She lives in Pennsylvania with her husband. Of course, once again, the book we are here for this evening is titled After Trauma, Lessons on Overcoming from a First Responder Turned Crisis Counselor. I've got to read just one blurb. I love this blurb. It's from Kelly Heron, who writes, quote, "After trauma shines a light on the darkness that trauma leaves behind and guides survivors through the tunnel of recovery in a sensitive, supportive manner. Realizing I was not alone in my nonlinear journey of trauma recovery gave me a sense of peace and a feeling of solidarity with other survivors," end quote. It truly is an honor to host the book launch for Allie this evening. So please, without further ado, join me in giving Allie and Carl a warm Harrisburg welcome.
Hello. Can everybody hear me okay?
How about me? We good?
We can be loud if we need to be.
Yeah, we got great instructions. Thank you for all
That's
the
true.
help.
Yeah, thanks. Thank
Thank
you.
you for everybody coming here tonight. I guess to start off, I mean, this has been a long time coming this night.
Long time.
And I want to talk a little bit about how we met.
Yeah.
So going on almost a decade ago now, I was working with this organization called Minding Your Mind. We did mental health education in middle schools and high schools, and we went to a in-service day for teachers to talk about our programs. And before our program, this woman got up and just gave a stellar presentation. And after our presentation, when everybody was leaving, me and my boss chased her down the hallway, and we learned that her name was Allie Rothrock. Was it even Rothrock at the time?
I think it was Warren at the time.
It was Warren at the
it was
time. You're 100% right.
Yeah. A long time ago.
Yeah. And so I've been honored to be able to see Allie kind of grow over this past 10 years. But I got to see that, and maybe everybody in here didn't get to see the whole journey. So I'd love to start by going back to 2010 when you were self-publishing your first book, and the idea for After was there. Can you bring us back to that moment?
Yeah. So my first book was self-published in 2010, like Carl said, and that book was written just out of necessity. So it was my way to process what I had experienced. And then the act of putting it on the page and self-publishing it, like seeing the story through from the living of it to the actual, it is a real book. That was the way I needed to process that story. but I was 21 when that book was published. And, there's 12 years in between that book and this one. And when I published Where Hope Lives, I thought that would be the only book that I ever wrote. So I said everything I thought I had to say at the time and thought that that would be that. But as soon as that book was published, the day I sent it to the printer and sent him all my money that I had saved, I went and sat at my desk and opened up a new Word document and just kept writing, because that had been my habit for so long. And somewhere in the back of my head, even not consciously, I knew there was more to say. There was more story that needed to be told. When I published Where Hope Lives, I did not know that my mental health had been affected the way that it was. I didn't know that I wanted to explore this concept of after with other survivors. And so, 12 years ago, I can go back in my journals and see that this idea was there, but I just didn't know it consciously for a lot longer.
Oh, that's so great. And so was writing a big part of your life before you published that book? Like, can you tell us how you became somebody who was writing and became a writer?
Yeah. So I joined the fire service in October of 2005. And I believe it was divine intervention that 2 months before I became a firefighter, I picked up a journal at my summertime job because I needed something to do that I could still be paying attention to what I was doing. And I just started writing about what I did that day, the people that I met. There was a wrestling camp of college boys, and I like to watch them over there and just write about that. And so I just had this habit where every day I would write about what I saw, felt, experienced. And then when I started firefighting, that became the thing that kept my head above water for all of that, was that activity of getting things out of my brain and onto the page. And so now thinking about it, it makes sense that publishing Where Hope Lives didn't stop that habit. It just continued on.
Yeah. And for as long as I've known you, writing has been a big part of your life. And I've always enjoyed you sharing that with people. But I remember in 2017, some things really happened that I think like solidified what was just an idea. You want to talk about that a little?
Yeah, absolutely. So like I said, 2010, I just was writing in a Word document, and I would have a thought about a hard thing that I'd experienced, or maybe anger that I had, or sadness that I had about things that I had gone through. And I was just sort of writing that on the page, and this Word document grew to hundreds and hundreds of pages. It was very chaotic. There was nothing in there but just sort of my free flowing thoughts. But it was 7 years in that Word document at that point, 2010 to 2017. And then in 2017, two things happened that gave me the clarity that I was looking for about like, what's the lens that I'm telling my story through? Because I've already told it. It exists in a book. It's in Where Hope Lives. What's the new take on this that I have? And so the first thing that happened was in March 2017, I was listening to an episode of the My Favorite Murder podcast, which is like a true crime comedy podcast. People nod, they know it's very popular. And the host, Georgia and Karen, they start at the show and they talk about like, this serial killer was caught, or this crime happened or something. And they told a story about a woman named Kelly Heron. And like 3 days before that, Kelly had been training for a marathon. She was a runner, and she stopped. She was out near her house in Seattle, and she stopped at this sort of like bathroom on this beach in this state park to go to the bathroom and warm her hands because it was March and it was raining and freezing. And in that bathroom, there was a man hiding in a stall who later would tell the police that he was waiting in that stall to rape someone. So his intentions were very clear. And he attacked Kelly, and she fought and saved her own life and got out of that and sent him to jail. And I heard them tell about her story and what she did. And I thought, that is someone who was in the very beginning of their after. She got really famous for doing something that she just did instinctually to try to save her life and get away from this guy. And so I found her on social media, and I just thought, I wonder if she'd be willing to talk with me. I had been thinking about this concept of like a before and an after, as I'd been thinking about my own before and after. And so I sent her like a DM on Facebook, and she got back to me and she said, I'm so overwhelmed with all the interview requests. She'd been on Good Morning America. I mean, she'd done all the ones. And she said, I can't talk about this anymore. And I said, good for you. I'm proud of you. Set that boundary. And I just said, like, good luck, be well. And I thought that would be that. And a couple weeks later, she messaged me back and said, of all the interviews that I turned down, you were the only person that like congratulated me on that and said it was good to set that boundary. So she said, I would love to tell you my story. And I've been so blessed to become her friend in the years since. And I watched her get married, and she's just living this wonderful life. But once I did that initial interview with her, and I wrote it all out, and I saw what she did, how powerful it was, not what I had written, but really the full enormity of her actions on that day. I thought, I know I can self-publish a book because I've already done that. But if I'm going to include her story in whatever this book is going to be, I want more people to know about it. Her story deserves more eyes than just a self-published author can get it. And so that was my first, I want to maybe do this in a different way than I'd done it before. And then 2 months later, May 22nd of 2017, I was living in Philadelphia with my husband, and he snapped a picture of me, which is so funny to look at now. I was sitting at our dining room table. I had my headphones in, and I had a blank sheet of paper in front of me, and I'm kind of sitting like this. And he was like, "What are you doing? Like, are you okay? What's going on?" And that whole day, for whatever reason, I felt like whatever this was supposed to be was like right there, like right there. And so I was just trying to keep my mind as open as possible to whatever clarity was going to come. And I'm sitting there at the table, and my phone lights up with a news alert about the bombing that happened outside of the Ariana Grande concert in Manchester. And so we turned on the TV and we watched these girls running out of the arena and ambulances and parents trying to get to them. And I watched these girls take their very first steps into their after. And I thought, that's what it is. It's about after. It's about the choices that you make after, and how the choices you made before affect the choices you make after. And I was really interested in this concept of the afters of different types of trauma. Like, there's trauma that happens from a solitary incident that's not really your fault, like a car accident or an incident of mass violence. And then there's relational trauma that happens when you're in relationship with someone, not necessarily romantic, but it could be a coworker or an acquaintance. That was where my trauma came from, and how your paths forward change depending on what your experience was. And so it was those two events sort of back to back. The interview with Kelly really made me start seeking out other people's stories, and I'm so honored to include so many of them in after. And then it was really like watching that, the aftermath of that bombing, and watching those girls and wondering, like, who are they going to be tomorrow, next week, next year, that really solidified that. And I write about that a lot in the book.
Awesome. Now, at the time, both of us were sharing our personal stories of recovery regularly, not to mention to high schoolers, which are not the easiest audience.
And middle schoolers.
And middle schoolers. And I remember when you came up with the name After, and you were so excited, and I thought it was so powerful. And then over like the next year, I watched you contend with this shift. Like, up until this point, you shared your story to help other people, but also to like earn a spot at the table. By sharing your story, I watched you earn the trust and the ear of people that weren't previously listening. And when you did that long enough, they started asking for you to share more, right? And so I watched this shift happen in 2018, where you really went from a person who was telling your story to a person who realized the power of stories. Can you tell us about that transition?
Yeah. So I spoke about what happened in 2017, and then sort of leading up to 2018, which is where we sort of solidified, like, we became business partners, and we took this idea that I'd had, that you'd watch me contend with for a long time, and talked about, like, how can we do this better and reach more people. But after interviewing Kelly, I had talked to, like, we have a story from Jim Tucker, and after I interviewed him right after Kelly, he was shot at the shooting where Congresswoman Gabrielle Giffords was shot. And he was standing right next to her. Like, there's a picture that he sent me that's him, his wife, and her, and you can see the shooter and the reflection of the grocery store walk up. And so I had his story, and we explored the concept of closure. I was really interested to hear his thoughts there. And he basically said, that's not a thing. Closure is not a thing. He said, like, I'll never be rid of the chronic pain, the injuries. I had to retire from a job I loved, all these things. But he said, what I do have is choice. I have choice in what I do each day, how I carry these memories. And so with each person that I saw how their identity was changed in trauma, I started to really explore how mine was changed, and maybe be able to discern a little bit more of why I was telling my story so much. And we've both spoken hundreds and hundreds of times on stages. Our first time together on a stage was in 2013, Carl.
Do you want to tell them about what the people said to you, some of the stigma we faced even on day one?
Absolutely. So the first time I did a talk, first time sharing my story, you did 7 health classes in a row. I came in to pinch hit, do the last one. And then we were doing a parent night that night. And the health teacher introduced me and said, you know how we've been talking about mental health kids, and these middle schoolers like nodded. And she goes, well, she doesn't look crazy, does she?
That's day one.
day one.
Yeah.
And I said, all right. And so
Yeah.
it was a version of that often, things
Right.
that we heard from teachers, from parents, from
Yeah.
educators, the stigma that they had,
Yeah.
the stigma that we work to combat and on the job and off now for first responders. But that identity shift and how am I carrying my story and
Yeah.
how can I help other people carry theirs? That's why when I realized that I wanted to tell more than just my story in this book, that's when it changed from just a chaotic Word document that didn't have a lot of structure. It became something bigger.
Yeah. And I think you really embody this idea of wanting to compound the amount of people you could help. And in this period, you went to every conference. If somebody would let you share this message, you were going. You were calling multiple times, and you were all over the country every week, every weekend. And you were just so tired.
I'm so tired, Carl.
But people were really appreciating what you had to say. And they were saying, you should come to our state.
Come to these 12 places.
Yeah.
And I remember walking into our office and I like stood up against a wall with my head against the wall. And I said, Carl, I'm in Colorado, Los Angeles, and North Dakota next week.
Yeah.
I cannot do this way anymore.
Yeah. And what I watched you do was claim back your space, do what you had to do for you. But in that, you also saw that you had the power, you had the voice to elevate other people's voices and other people's stories. And when you started doing that through On the Job and Off, through your publications, the amount of people who you have reached has just been like exponential, and that's been super exciting.
Yeah.
And so that was the next couple of years was super exciting. And then the world shut down.
Sure did.
But
Yeah.
that was a big year for you.
Right.
Beyond COVID.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. So 2018 is when we started our company On the Job and Off, and we started to reach first responders on their phones and on their computers. And I no longer had to be physically standing in front of them to deliver a message, which was just the best thing ever. I remember filming that course, my husband Forrest was there, and I remember putting it up live for the first time and watching how many people were taking it. And that was, 2018, 2019, we were growing that company. And the idea for this book was growing even more. I was interviewing more people. I interviewed Frank Lieb, who's a battalion chief in the FDNY, about his experiences on 9/11. We have Frank DeAngelis, who was the principal at Columbine High School at the time of their shooting there. We have Lynn Shiner, who is a good friend of Lisa Zoll, whose children were murdered on Christmas Eve. And so I was gathering this like wealth of stories. And that was happening more and more. And every time I would sit down to write, which was every day, we had On the Job and Off, I was still working full time at another job and trying to write this book. And I just didn't see how it was going to be possible to do it all. I felt like the time for the story was now, but I literally had no more working hours in my day. And it was March 2020. I was working as a CISM team member. If you're on a CISM team with me, raise your hand. Get your hands up, Lisa. Get it up. Annie, thank you. Good. Work. So I got to meet all these wonderful people. And what CISM is, first of all, it's critical incident stress management. So after a critical incident happens for first responders, we and the other people on our team go out and we sit with the first responders and give them a space to process their feelings, usually within the first 24 hours as something happens. I've been there, an hour after something happened. So I was getting to do all of this work as well. And just really, the story was becoming so much more. And in March, we had a firefighter killed in Cumberland County and worked a lot with those responders there. And this book was just like, it was right there. I just had no time. I had no time. And then the world shut down and I watched every single speaking engagement come off of my calendar. And for the first time in a decade, I had nowhere to go. I had nowhere to go. I was running On the Job and Off full time at that point, working from my house already. So my life changed in very small ways, except that I wasn't traveling anymore. And when COVID happened, the Word document that I had been working in was about 30,000 words, which is not enough for a book, but it's not nothing. And I realized, like, this is my moment. If I am ever going to write this book, it has to be now. What a gift in a weird way, in a hard way, to have that time. And so March and April of 2020, I wrote until that Word document was 100,000 words. So I wrote 70,000 words in about a month and a half. And at that point, that's a legitimate manuscript. That is enough there that maybe someone else would be interested in it. And I knew that I wanted to try to get a book deal because from Kelly's story and all the other ones that I included, they were so big, they deserved people to know about them. And so I was like, all right, I'm going to get a book deal. What do I need to do that? I need to get a literary agent. And those things are like winning the lottery. Nobody does that. Nobody you know is that lucky. That just does not happen. And I heard time and time again, to get a literary agent, like 99% of the time, it's not going to work. To get an actual book deal, again, it's like 99.9% of the time, it's not going to work. But I had time, I had a manuscript, and I just felt like this is the time to try for this book. And so I reached out to someone that I knew named Taylor Schumann, who I was so fortunate enough to actually have write the foreword for this book, because I've been trying to get a book deal and there were little bites here and there, but nothing really amounted to anything. I knew Taylor had a book deal, which I thought she probably has a literary agent. So I sent her a DM through Instagram, not knowing if she'd read it or care. And I just said, can you tell me about your experience in the publishing world? Here's what I've written. Here's what I'm trying to do. And she connected me with her literary agent, who is now my literary agent. And Keely, hi Keely, looked at the manuscript and she said, this is great. It's long. And I was like, yeah, it's long. It's a long one. And she said, I want you to have this professionally edited before I will sign you. Like, do some of the work before I sign you. I think it was also like, show me that you're committed to this. How hard are you going to work for this? And so I found an editor and paid for it on my own. And like May, June, July, we edited the first draft. And then Keely signed me in October. And by December, I had a book deal. The week that Where Hope Lives turned 10, I got the book deal. Yeah. And they said it won't come out till 2022, which seemed like, light years. We were in the middle of a pandemic, and they basically said, we don't know what the world is going to look like when this book comes out. It might be basically impossible to get in front of anyone. It just might be really hard to do anything in person. And for authors that had books that came out in 2020 and 2021, they didn't get to do this. They didn't get to do any of the, writing a book is so solitary. You just sit, nobody cares. Like, you're just doing it because you want to see it through. And so getting to do this is just that much, just with that perspective, is that much more special. So 2020 was really, it's weird to say, but it was a gift for me because I got time. I got time that I would not have otherwise had. And that's what led to this.
Yeah, in the book, you talk about the difference between fault and responsibility, right? And COVID was not your fault, but you took responsibility of what you did in that time. Can you just share a little bit about like how that theme runs through the book? Because I think that like you exemplified in COVID what you had been doing the decade prior. It was just in a very different way.
Yeah, absolutely. That was something that I explored a lot in my early trauma recovery was, 21-year-old Allie thought that the people who hurt me were also responsible for making me better. Like, you did this, so it's your job to fix it through an apology, through something that has not ever come, those things have not, I don't expect them to at this point, but I was stuck. Because here you have people who acted in a way that was really hurtful over a long period of time. And I'm waiting for them to change and help me move on with the rest of my life. And that's where you get stuck in victimhood, and you get stuck as thinking like, I am someone who has been hurt, and that is all that I am. That is my identity. That is how I'm going to move through this world, because it's happened so many times. And like I said earlier, my trauma was relational. So, as humans, we're wired to be connected with other people. But when you can't trust that connection anymore, it's hard to know, like, where do I go for connection? And back in like 2012, 2013, I got really lucky with who I made those sort of initial safe connections with. Hannah, best friend Hannah, who I lived with during that time. Carl, I met during that time. I met my husband Forrest during that time. So I was able to try to take a little bit more responsibility for how I wanted the rest of my life to go. And so there's a chapter in here, I believe it's chapter 6, that says, your life is your responsibility. Whatever happened, whatever anyone did, accountability matters, change in behavior matters, all of those things matter, but they do not determine what the rest of your life looks like. And that was the change that set me free from being stuck in that place of, I need these people to make this better. I saw that I was able to make it better. And I get asked a lot about this concept of justice. When people hear my story, some of the harder parts, especially if I tell it in front of cops, we have 2 sitting here, their first question is, did anyone go to jail? What happened? Like, they're reading me the list of laws that they broke. And I'm like, you're not telling me anything I don't already know. I tried those paths and, people were not receptive and I did not get the help that I needed at the time. But I was able to sort of change my lens on that experience and see that telling my story for the hundreds of times that I've told it, telling it in here, that's what justice looks like for me. Didn't come in a jail or a jury or any of that.
Yeah.
It came from telling the truth, being able to do that as a version of myself that I like, and in being believed. That's what survivors want, is just for people to say, I believe you that
Yeah.
happened. Yeah.
Well, yeah. And if you want to talk justice, all the first responders in Pennsylvania get to see your education. And that was such a full circle for me. I can't imagine what a full circle it was for you. Do you want to share a little bit of that
Sure.
moment? We could...
Yeah. So I've been a firefighter in Pennsylvania. That's, various places, but it's always been in this state. And except for the sexual assault that I experienced, which was in a different state, everything else happened here. And so when we started on the job and off, we were thinking of how can we reach as many people as possible. It took me about 10 months to get a meeting with someone very high up in the state. And I wanted him to, like, it was already in the bag before I went in the meeting. I was so confident. And I wanted him to basically buy the education that we had created and put online and then offer it to every firefighter in the state. So every firefighter in the state would have to see my face and hear my story and sit with it and think, how am I possibly contributing to an environment like this, or what can I do better? And getting that contract easily took a decade off my life. You were there for that.
Yeah.
It was the hardest thing I've ever done in business, but we got it twice.
Yeah.
And that, like, sitting in that man's office, knowing that he's in charge of every firefighter in the state, knowing what I had gone through in his firehouses, and be able to say, here's what happened, here's what we did about it, and here's what we have done to try to make sure that doesn't happen to anyone else again. And for him to write us that check and to sign that contract, that to me was also kind of justice.
Yeah. Full circle at least.
Yeah. And then some.
Before we start to wrap it up, can you tell me, like, what do you see as the future of after trauma, or what kind of impact you want to see?
Yeah. So I've sat with this book for over a decade. So I've had a lot of time to think about, like, what do I want people to feel when they close the book? There are a lot of ways to tell hard stories, and my hope is always to tell it through that hopeful lens of trauma doesn't have to be the end. It can be a beginning. That's what I've seen. And so I hope that it's a companion for people, that they can feel like there's someone walking with them through, if you're reading it because you yourself have experienced trauma, or you love someone that has experienced trauma, or you want to work with people that have experienced that it makes people feel a little bit less alone. Like they understand a little bit more about really, like, my walk down into the depths and then my walk back out. Because a lot of times we only see that first part and it's so half the story, but it takes a lot of time and a lot of intention and a lot of grit to be able to put words to all of those moments, because there's plenty of moments where I'd be fine if I never talked about them again. But the story has to be complete. It has to be a cohesive story from, beginning to end. Not that it's over, but I want it to be that companion piece. And one of my favorite pieces in this, and something that I've heard so much about from the early readers, is, I explore, so the book's in two parts. The first part is like that walk down sort of, and the second part is me walking back out. And I got some trauma therapy. That was exactly what I needed. I found the therapist who I needed when I needed it back in like 2011, 12. And one of my favorite parts in the book is last year, I met with her again and just revisited that time, because I wanted to see, am I remembering this correctly? I want to make sure I'm writing about it accurately, but am I remembering this correctly? Did you say the things that I've been saying that you did that were so helpful? And so exploring that and putting that lens on that time in my life was really cool for me. And I've seen for people too, that it's meant a lot to them to know that, their therapists really do care about them and really do want to see them get better. And I think it was as cool for Jill, my therapist, to revisit that time with me too, because similar, like with first responders, you help people when they need you and then you never see them again. Did you get better? Did they live? We don't know. We're always trying to find that out. And so for her, like, I just loved revisiting that. And I love that conversation that we had, because we're usually seeing therapists when there's something wrong. But it was really cool to go back and talk to her when things were really good. So I love that in there. And yeah, I hope that it helps people feel less alone. That's like my ultimate goal.
Okay, last question.
Yeah.
Are you writing anything else?
Yes,
Q&A?
that's all I can say.
All right, Q&A.
Great.
Let's give it up for Allie. Thank you so much for this time.
For Carl, thank you.
All right, so time for the audience Q&A portion of the event. If you have a question for Allie, feel free to raise your hand. I've got the running mic here, so I'll go around and run around. So who wants to be first? And if not, I'll start. Okay, over here.
Hi.
Hey.
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 I don't have a question, but I just want to say thank you for being so generous with your vulnerability, because this book is going to help so many people. It's helped me. It's helped everyone I know who's already read it. So thank you.
Thanks, Jay. Love
You're
you.
welcome. Congratulations.
Thanks. Shout it out, Laura Jo. Yeah. That's a fun question. I described writing a book to someone the other day as it's if you're assembling a puzzle, but you don't know if you have all the pieces yet. You don't know what it looks like when it's complete. And that is exhausting. And you might write for 10 hours and end up with one paragraph that will actually be in this. But my favorite part is when those puzzle pieces come together, when you finally figure out when I finally was like, that's what I'm trying to say. That one sentence, it took me all week, but I got it. That was my favorite part. And when you get that enough, it keeps you coming back through a decade of just looking at a Word document. That was a fun question. We
Right.
love puzzles in our family, puzzling family. Yeah.
I would have thought you would have said highlighters and Post-its.
A color-coded pen collection is what I pride myself on, of nothing else. So you would see me come to the office and just lay out like I went to Staples and just cleaned up. I love that too. I do handwrite almost everything, and it drives like my editor and publisher crazy, because I'd be like, can I just scan these printer pages in? And they're like, no, you have to type it.
Mhm.
So yeah, that's a good point. Anything else?
Other questions?
Yeah, Brandon. Yeah, you're
Good.
fine.
Good.
Hey, congratulations on writing a book. That's
Thank you.
awesome. So I work at the state government and everything's like policy and blah, blah, blah. Is there any policy or support or structure that you or the folks you spoke to wish you had when you needed it, that just like wasn't there, that should be there?
That's a great question. The easiest answer to that is you need more than one type of person making the decisions. That's a thing we can all say and agree on. It's harder to actually do. But when I speak directly to decision makers, people who decide who gets hired in a firehouse, or if there's a pregnancy policy or not, or things like that. And when I tell my story, it happens every time. I will see little groups of fire chiefs whispering and looking at me weird. And I'm just like, come ask me. I know what you're going to ask me. And every time they say, we have one woman firefighter or 2 dispatchers or 3 EMTs or whatever, and we have never asked them what their experience is like at work. We've never asked them. And they're not trying to be ignorant. It's just not their experience. They've never thought about it before. And so the other piece is just giving people permission to have those conversations and be humble enough to listen to the answer. Maybe the work environment is garbage, and the fire chief or whoever needs to be able to see their role in that, even if it's just simply they had no idea, and take the steps necessary to help people feel safe at work. Our jobs are dangerous enough. We should be able to feel safe, where we do that. So the easy answer is more people at the seat of the table, more people at the table making decisions. If you just have the same type of person and you're just seeing the world and policy and law through their eyes, you're going to get the same type of policy written every time. So lots of people making decisions. That's what we need.
Yeah. Yeah. And one of the things that I heard in there that I've seen you do a lot is you do a wonderful job at bridging unfamiliar concepts to people. And I think that that's why you put stories first because they really allow people to see a perspective that they hadn't before.
Right.
And it's always impressive when you go in a room where everybody's trying to stonewall you. And then at the end, you get, you get the work done. That's
Yeah.
really cool.
Thanks. Any other questions?
Yes.
No. So firefighting is a male-dominated profession.
98%.
Yep. And what can be done? Have you seen that the Me Too movement has helped women firefighters? I know you were in San Francisco. You really liked when you had
Mhm.
the female chief out there who
Mhm.
kind of took you under her wing and you saw what it could be
Yeah.
for a woman in a fire
Yeah.
department. What has Me Too helped or not helped in this area?
It has absolutely helped because the more stories that we are hearing, the easier it is to tell them. And that's, I think, what telling my story so publicly does, even though it's hard and the reactions are hard sometimes and the feedback is hard sometimes. I do it because when people see me do it and the ground doesn't open up and swallow me whole, they think that maybe just to their friend or their parent or whoever, they can do the same thing. So I really try to lead by that example. And I think if I were to get up or write and say at the beginning of the book, like, I'm going to change your mind on these 5 things, no one would read that. No one wants to be like preached at like that. So I try to come from that perspective of just, here's what happened to me. Let's see how it makes you feel. And then what change can we, what action can we take from that feeling? So Me Too did that. It created a space for more stories to be told. And I have always received dozens and dozens of DMs and emails and notes all the time from women firefighters everywhere. But what Me Too did was it allowed them to start saying it out loud in public. And that is momentum that has not stopped since, Me Too got super popular and is like less heard of now. So it's absolutely helped.
We're going to kick it up to David. Who's a
David.
question?
Hello, hello.
Hi.
Here, hold on. Let me just adjust this a little bit here. Here we go. So we have an online question. Is there a difference in how you feel after writing this book versus your first one? That's the first part of it. And the second half of the question is, thank you for both being at the core of what minding your mind is today.
Who do you think that is? Someone we know. You have to tell us their name later, David.
I will.
Okay. I absolutely felt different. Like I said, I was 21 when I published Where Hope Lives. And when I wrote and published that book, I was still just heads down in trying to survive what I had experienced. And like I said, getting that book out of me and getting it into the world in the way that I did. But it was also sort of anticlimactic. Like a box of books showed up at my house on December 10th, 2010. And then it was like, the book's out. And that was how the book came into the world. But I felt so accomplished because I had Googled how do you publish a book and print it off and just cross things off as I went. I did all of that, with help from my parents and my family, but I accomplished that goal. And then with this one, because of the other stories that I've included, because I got a book deal, which feels like will forever feel like winning the actual lottery, it feels so different because I feel like my worldview has expanded, my work has expanded, my identity and my motivation for telling my story has expanded. So it's absolutely changed, but I think my motivation has always been to help people feel less alone. Even if they don't come up and talk to me after, they give me a look that I've become very familiar with that just says like, I've been where you are, like, thanks for saying what you said, I'm gonna go. So yeah, I've absolutely felt different. This book was bigger in a lot of ways.
Okay, great. And then I actually have a question for you. So being as a social development, human development and family service major, how do you see disassociated grief affect the after trauma process?
Lisa Zoll, our resident clinician, would you like to disassociated? Is that the same as disenfranchised grief? Okay, so disenfranchised grief is when you're experiencing grief over something that isn't maybe like societally acceptable. Like say, thank you so much. So maybe like you lose a pet. And for some people, it's like your dog died, whatever. But for you, that is, for some people, it'd be like their spouse dying. That grief is not all the way respected, or like for same-sex couples, when that's not recognized as something, that grief like has sort of nowhere to go. Can you say the rest of the question after the disassociated, disenfranchised?
How do you feel, in how do your view that it affects the process of after trauma?
Well, it prolongs it, because when you're not able to feel what you're feeling and name it, and get validation in a way, like that's what therapy did for me. It was someone sitting across from me and saying, you're not crazy. This was as bad as you think it was. And here's how we're going to walk through it together, that validation. So when that grief is not able to be expressed or felt or supported, that version of you that's hurting so badly still needs to be comforted and seen. And when you can't get that for whatever reason, you're almost sort of stuck. But it doesn't have to be where you're stuck forever. We have fantastic clinicians and people who can help you navigate that. Lisa Zoll, raise your hand. Lisa Zoll is, among many things, a grief counselor who we work with at On the Job and Off to, to serve all our other first responders. And so, Lisa's someone that's walked with a lot of people through that exact type of grief. So if that's where you are, it doesn't have to be a permanent place.
Any other questions? Yes.
Hi, Allie.
Hi, Kate.
In After Trauma, you detail your brave walk to Jill's office for your first therapy session. And I wonder what advice you would give to anybody who is trying to make that leap.
You just have to do it. You just have to do it. We've had that where we have to go get help. Everything else has not worked. That's our last option. You just have to do it. It could be the hardest thing you've ever done, take the most energy you've ever had. You just have to do it, because the whole rest of your life is on the other side of that conversation. So whatever you have to do, get your butt in that office, work with your therapist, do what they say, and then you'll get to your other side.
Can I say one more thing? on that?
Please.
Just a quick thing. So whatever you imagine the worst case scenario with your therapist is going to be, that's the moment you're going to live until you go do it. And when you meet that therapist, it might be just as bad as you imagine, but at least you'll have done it. And we spent years living
Yeah,
the same. There you go. Right.
Yeah.
Right.
Do it
Probably
anyway.
not. I spent years living my worst nightmare to only go find that all of it was like much
Way
of
less
my own.
scary.
Yeah, it was way less scary. And so
Yeah, you just have to do it. And like there's a quote from you in this book that basically says like that thing you're so scared of, it could be that scary, but probably not. And at least when you can make decisions, you're stuck where you are.
Yeah, and the thing that I'm really honored to watch you have done is you took that decision and you turned it into the vehicle that's going to help like countless people. And like when you did that, that was like your overcoming, right? And I just think it's an incredible example to set for people, and I'm honored to be asked to be up here.
Thanks, Carl.
For sure.
Any other questions? Yes.
Let's have it, Brian.
So being a first responder myself, being a police officer, obviously a decade ago when you're writing and kind of going through this, not only are you breaking the barriers of a female coming into the fire department, but now you're starting to break barriers of talking about trauma in and of itself.
Yeah.
What has that been like to kind of not only battle getting into it, but now battling to people actually to talk about it? Whereas now you're starting to see that pendulum go the other way where they're starting to embrace it.
Right. Yeah. 5 years ago, I was speaking in little conference rooms. They have the keynote, the 3 after, then like little classroom sessions. Allie can go over there. I've now keynoted all of those conferences because people are willing to talk about mental health now. And with COVID, again, it's weird, but a gift of that was that we all experienced the same thing differently, but there was a universal human experience that we all had. So before, people could be like, well, I didn't go on that call. I, was in 10 years ago, we have SISM teams now, people are fine. Like whatever that is, we all experience something similar. And so I've seen the pendulum swing even farther, where doors that were so closed to us before, people who would never talk to me saying like, we have no one here that struggles, they're now calling because they see we all experience this thing that we can name. And it's not a blame. We're not tougher than the other person. We're all have experienced the same thing. But you're right, that was quite a shift, because just being able to be in a firehouse, physically in the space, was a fight Then to be safe in that space took a lot longer. And then to come back and say, hi, me again, gonna talk about this thing that no one wants to talk about. Gonna make it harder on myself in a lot of ways. But I had seen how I didn't have the resources I needed. The first responders that we've worked with don't have the resources they need. And so that to me was the motivation that kept me going for a decade to just, I'll go to Tennessee to talk to 3 people. I'll go to North Dakota in the winter to talk to whoever wants to come into this room, because it matters. We need to do better for ourselves, for trauma survivors, for first responders, for all of that. So it definitely made it harder for myself in the emergency services, but because the pendulum has swung and people are so much more willing to talk about it, like we were there and ready, and a name that people recognized when they were like, who can we get to talk about mental health? Allie hasn't shut up about it for 10 years. Let's get her. So yeah, thanks for your question.
Other questions? Yes.
Hi, I'm a middle school teacher. And so we both are actually, but we have a lot of students with trauma. And you had said earlier that people can get stuck in their victimhood. Working with children, it's really hard to get them to see the other side when they've experienced trauma. So do you have any advice for educators?
Yeah, I think it's about giving them their choices back in really small ways. Do you want to color, or do you want to do a craft? Do you want to do this, or do you want to do that? It's giving them a choice in really small ways to see that they do actually have power in their lives. It reminds me of when I first started to work with sexual assault survivors. Like I would show up in the hospital after someone had just arrived after being raped, and their fundamental right to choose what happened to their body was taken away from them. So we start by giving them little choices. Do you want to sit on the chair or on the bed? Do you want this medicine or this medicine? Do you want this person in the room or this person in the room? You start to reassert their own ability to make choices. And for kids who have no control or say over their home life, you know, it's not about talking about how can we make yourself more safe. Like when I worked in domestic violence, they don't have those options. But I think it could be about helping them regain their ability to choose, even in little small ways. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Well, the other thing that I heard you say is that this process started as an internal reflection for you, and it became an external, very external thing sometime later. But you also said that that doesn't have to be for everybody. That just finding your 1 or 2 safe people is maybe the only person you ever have to tell your story to.
Yeah.
But for me personally, the most powerful thing that I've seen in my personal life and in the work that I do is that when somebody tells a story and the other person thinks me too, that moment changes the relationship between those people. And it happens all the time, right? And it happens with the first responders, it happens. And as a teacher, you can't necessarily share all your personal experiences, but just in general, I think the ability for people to feel like they're not alone and hear that somebody else in the world gets it can often start to unlock the doors for you to do that exploration, because this is a long process, right? You know?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And that's what I would have said. My unfortunate news to teachers is you get such a small window with these kids that you just got to find the little things you can do to make your impact, but don't take on the full responsibility, because like this has been a decade-long process as an adult for Allie, right? And so I think there's very little that any one person can do. But if we are having these conversations as a group, if messages like this are getting out into the world and it becomes part of our zeitgeist, they're more likely to hear those messages more regularly. You can just be the first one. Yeah, great question.
Great answer.
So we have to wrap up. So this is going to be our last question.
Lucky me. First, Allie, congratulations.
Thanks,
This is
Amy.
awesome. Super
Thank you.
proud of you for being such a great trailblazer. My question is this. During 2020, when you're isolated and you're writing, can you talk to us a little bit about your own self-care experiences?
Absolutely. So I had a husband who was a firefighter and was still going to work every day before we understood the virus well. And so there was that sort of, you know, I wasn't leaving the house, but he was every day out with the public. So there was that sort of stress. But honestly, writing for me is my ultimate form of self-care. Even on deadlines, even on people saying, you know, we need this, then it is not a stress for me. It is just the way that I've always processed the world, and just the energy of the idea that maybe that manuscript that I was writing would become something that gave me so much just energy that I wouldn't have had if I didn't have that. But it's also important to take time away from those things. And so if I have a day where it's like, okay, I'm going to be writing for 10 hours, I will be sure that the people that work with me know after 4 p.m., unless the world is on fire, do not call me, because I need to have time where I'm just sort of disconnected. So I think in 2020, I got better at that disconnection. I don't need to know everything going on in the world as soon as it happens. It's okay to put the phones down, the news down, things like that. So I think I got better at that during that year. But the writing for me was a very active process that was really invigorating, honestly. Thanks, Annie.
Okay, let's give one more round of applause. Thank you so much to Carl. Congratulations again, Allie.
you.
We've got cookies and we've got books. So Allie's happy to sign books over at this table here. But thank you so much for coming out, everyone. And once again, one more round of applause for the party. And have a good night.
Thanks.